And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Chapter 6.
Dr. Armstrong was dreaming. It was very hot in the operating room. Surely they got the temperature too high. The sweat was rolling down his face. His hands were clammy, difficult to hold the scalpel firmly. How beautifully sharp it was. Easy to do a murder with a knife like that. And of course he was doing a murder. The woman's body looked different. It had been a large, unwieldy body. This was a spare, meager body, and the face was hidden. Who was it that he had to kill? He couldn't remember, but he must know. Should he ask Sister? Sister was watching him. No, he couldn't ask her. She was suspicious, he could see that. But who was it on the operating table? They shouldn't have covered up the face like that. If he could only see the face. Ah, that was better. A young probationer was pulling off the handkerchief. Emily Brent, of course. It was Emily Brent that he had to kill. How malicious her eyes were. Her lips were moving. What was she saying? In the midst of life we are in death. She was laughing now. No, nurse, don't put the handkerchief back. I've got to see. I've got to give the anesthetic. Where's the ether? I must have brought the ether with me. What have you done with the ether, sister? Chateauneuf du Pape? Yes, that will do quite as well. Take the handkerchief away, nurse. Of course, I knew it all the time. It's Anthony Marston. His face is purple and convulsed. But he's not dead. He's laughing. I tell you he's laughing. He's shaking the operating table. Look out, man. Look out. Nurse, steady it, steady it. With a start, Dr. Armstrong woke up. It was morning. Sunlight was pouring into the room. And someone was leaning over him, shaking him. It was Rogers. Rogers, with a white face, saying, Doctor, doctor. Dr. Armstrong woke up completely. He sat up in bed. He said sharply, What is it? It's the wife, doctor. I can't get her to wake. My God, I can't get her to wake. And she don't look right to me. Dr. Armstrong was quick and efficient. He wrapped himself in his dressing gown and followed Rogers. He bent over the bed where the woman was lying peacefully on her side. He lifted the cold hand, raised the eyelid. It was a few minutes before he straightened himself and turned from the bed. Rogers whispered, Is she... He passed a tongue over dry lips. Armstrong nodded. Yes, she's gone. His eyes rested thoughtfully on the man before him. Then they went to the table by the bed, to the washstand, then back to the sleeping woman. Rogers said, Was it her heart, doctor? Dr. Armstrong was a minute or two before replying. Then he said, What was her health like normally? Rogers said, She was a bit rheumatic-y. Any doctor been attending her recently? Doctor? Rogers stared. Not been to a doctor for years, neither of us. You'd no reason to believe she suffered from heart trouble. No, doctor, I never knew of anything. Armstrong said, Did she sleep well? Now Rogers' eyes evaded his. The man's hands came together and turned and twisted uneasily. He muttered, She didn't sleep extra well, no. The doctor said sharply, Did she take things to make her sleep? Rogers stared at him, surprised. Take things to make her sleep? Not that I knew of. I'm sure she didn't. Armstrong went over to the washstand. There were a certain number of bottles on it. Hair lotion, lavender water, cascara, glycerin of cucumber for the hands, a mouthwash, toothpaste, and some elements. Rogers helped by pulling out the drawers of the dressing table. From there they moved on to the chest of drawers. But there was no sign of sleeping draughts or tablets. Rogers said, She didn't have nothing last night, sir, except what you gave her. When the gong sounded for breakfast at 9 o'clock, it found everyone up and awaiting the summons. General MacArthur and the judge had been pacing the terrace outside, exchanging desultory comments on the political situation. Vera Claythorne and Philip Lombard had been up to the summit of the island behind the house. There they had discovered William Henry Blore, standing staring at the mainland. He said, No sign of that motorboat yet. I've been watching for it. Vera said, smiling, Devon's a sleepy county. Things are usually late. Philip Lombard was looking the other way, out to sea. He said abruptly, "What do you think of the weather?" Glancing up at the sky, Blore remarked, "Looks all right to me." Lombard pursed up his mouth into a whistle. He said, "It will come on to blow before the day's out." Blore said, "Squally, eh?" From below them came the boom of a gong. Philip Lombard said, "Breakfast? Well, I could do with some." As they went down the steep slope, Blore said to Lombard in a ruminating voice, "You know, it beats me. Why that young fellow wanted to do himself in. I've been worrying about it all night." Vera was a little ahead. Lombard hung back slightly. He said, "Got any alternative theory?" "I'd want some proof, motive to begin with. Well off I should say he was." Emily Brent came out of the drawing-room window to meet them. She said sharply, "Is the boat coming?" "Not yet," said Vera. They went into breakfast. There was a vast dish of eggs and bacon on the sideboard and tea and coffee. Rogers held the door open for them to pass in, then shut it from the outside. Emily Brent said, "That man looks ill this morning." Dr. Armstrong, who was standing by the window, cleared his throat. He said, "You must excuse any shortcomings this morning. Rogers has had to do the best he can for breakfast single-handed. Mrs. Rogers has not been able to carry on this morning." Emily Brent said sharply, "What's the matter with the woman?" Dr. Armstrong said easily, "Let us start our breakfast. The eggs will be cold. Afterwards, there are several matters I want to discuss with you all." They took the hint. Plates were filled, coffee and tea was poured. The meal began. Discussion of the island was, by mutual consent, tabooed. They spoke instead in the desultory fashion of current events. The news from abroad, events in the world of sport, the latest reappearance of the Loch Ness Monster. Then, when plates were cleared, Dr. Armstrong moved back his chair a little, cleared his throat importantly, and spoke. He said, "I thought it better to wait until you had had your breakfast before telling you of a sad piece of news. Mrs. Rogers died in her sleep." There were startled and shocked ejaculations. Vera exclaimed, "How awful! 2 deaths on this island since we arrived." Mr. Justice Wargrave, his eyes narrowed, said in his small, precise, clear voice, Very remarkable. What was the cause of death?" Armstrong shrugged his shoulders. "Impossible to say offhand. There must be an autopsy. I certainly couldn't give a certificate. I have no knowledge whatsoever of the woman's state of health." Vera said, "She was a very nervous-looking creature, and she had a shock last night. It might have been heart failure, I suppose." Dr. Armstrong said dryly, "Her heart certainly failed to beat, but what caused it to fail is the question." One word fell from Emily Brent. It fell hard and clear into the listening group. "Conscience," she said. Armstrong turned to her. "What exactly do you mean by that, Miss Brent?" Emily Brent, her lips tight and hard, said, "You all heard. She was accused, together with her husband, of having deliberately murdered her former employer, an old lady." "And you think?" Emily Brent said, "I think that accusation was true. You all saw her last night. She broke down completely and fainted. The shock of having her wickedness brought home to her was too much for her. She literally died of fear." Dr. Armstrong shook his head doubtfully. "It is a possible theory," he said. "One cannot adopt it without more exact knowledge of her state of health, if there was cardiac weakness." Emily Brent said quietly, "Call it, if you prefer, an act of God." Everyone looked shocked. Mr. Blore said uneasily, "That's carrying things a bit far, Miss Brent." She looked at them with shining eyes. Her chin went up. She said, "You regard it as impossible that a sinner should be struck down by the wrath of God. I do not." The judge stroked his chin. He murmured in a slightly ironic voice, "My dear lady, in my experience of ill-doing, Providence leaves the work of conviction and chastisement to us mortals, and the process is often fraught with difficulties. There are no shortcuts." Emily Brent shrugged her shoulders. Blore said sharply, "What did she have to eat and drink last night after she went up to bed?" Armstrong said, "Nothing. She didn't take anything. A cup of tea, a drink of water. I'll bet you she had a cup of tea. That sort always does." "Rogers assures me she had nothing whatsoever." "Ah," said Blore, "but he might say so." His tone was so significant that the doctor looked at him sharply. Philip Lombard said, "So that's your idea?" Blore said aggressively, "Well, why not? We all heard that accusation last night. Maybe sheer moonshine, just plain lunacy. On the other hand, it may not. Allow for the moment that it's true. Rogers and his missus polished off that old lady. Well, where does that get you? They've been feeling quite safe and happy about it." Vera interrupted. In a low voice she said, "No, I don't think Mrs. Rogers ever felt safe." Blore looked slightly annoyed at the interruption. "Just like a woman," his glance said. He resumed, "That's as may be. Anyway, there's no active danger to them as far as they know. Then, last night, some unknown lunatic spills the beans. What happens? The woman cracks. She goes to pieces. Notice how her husband hung over her as she was coming round. Not all husbandly solicitude. Not on your life. He was like a cat on hot bricks, scared out of his life as to what she might say. And there's the position for you. They've done a murder and got away with it. But if the whole thing's going to be raked up, what's going to happen? 10 to 1, the woman will give the show away. She hasn't got the nerve to stand up and brazen it out. She's a living danger to her husband. That's what she is. He's all right. He'll lie with a straight face till kingdom comes. But he can't be sure of her. And if she goes to pieces, his neck's in danger. So he slips something into a cup of tea and makes sure that her mouth is shut permanently." Armstrong said slowly, "There was no empty cup by her bedside. There was nothing there at all. I looked." Blore snorted. "Of course there won't be. First thing he'd do when she drunk it would be to take that cup and saucer away and wash it up carefully." There was a pause. Then General MacArthur said doubtfully, "It may be so, but I should hardly think it possible that a man would do that to his wife." Blore gave a short laugh. He said, "When a man's neck's in danger, he doesn't stop to think too much about sentiment." There was a pause. Before anyone could speak, the door opened and Rogers came in. He said, looking from one to the other, "Is there anything more I can get you?" Mr. Justice Wargrave stirred a little in his chair. He asked, "What time does the motorboat usually come over?" "Between 7 and 8, sir. Sometimes it's a bit after 8. Don't know what Fred Narracott can be doing this morning. If he's ill, he'd send his brother." Philip Lombard said, "What's the time now?" 10 minutes to 10, sir." Lombard's eyebrows rose. He nodded slowly to himself. Rogers waited a minute or two. General MacArthur spoke suddenly and explosively. "Sorry to hear about your wife, Rogers. Doctor's just been telling us." Rogers inclined his head. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." He took up the empty bacon dish and went out. Again, there was a silence. On the terrace outside, Philip Lombard said, "About this motorboat." Blore looked at him. Blore nodded his head. He said, "I know what you're thinking, Mr. Lombard. I've asked myself the same question. Motorboat ought to have been here nigh on 2 hours ago. It hasn't come. Why?" "Found the answer?" asked Lombard. "It's not an accident. That's what I say. It's part and parcel of the whole business. It's all bound up together." Philip Lombard said, "It won't come, you think?" A voice spoke behind him, a testy, impatient voice. "The motorboat's not coming," it said. Blore turned his square shoulders slightly and viewed the last speaker thoughtfully. "You think not too, General?" General MacArthur said sharply, "Of course it won't come. We're counting on the motorboat to take us off the island. That's the meaning of the whole business. We're not going to leave the island. None of us will ever leave. It's the end, you see, the end of everything." He hesitated. Then he said in a low, strange voice, "That's peace, real peace, to come to the end, not to have to go on. Yes, peace." He turned abruptly and walked away, along the terrace, then down the slope towards the sea, obliquely, to the end of the island where loose rocks went out into the water. He walked a little unsteadily, like a man who was only half awake. Blore said, "There goes another one who's balmy. Looks as though it will end with the whole lot going that way." Philip Lombard said, "I don't fancy you will, Blore." The ex-inspector laughed. "It would take a lot to send me off my head," he added dryly. "And I don't think you'll be going that way either, Mr. Lombard." Philip Lombard said, "I feel quite sane at the minute, thank you." Dr. Armstrong came up onto the terrace. He stood there hesitating. To his left were Blore and Lombard. To his right was Wargrave, slowly pacing up and down, his head bent down. Armstrong, after a moment of indecision, turned towards the latter. But at that moment Rogers came quickly out of the house. "Could I have a word with you, sir, please?" Armstrong turned. He was startled at what he saw. Rogers' face was working. Its color was grayish-green. His hand shook. It was such a contrast to his restraint of a few minutes ago that Armstrong was quite taken aback. "Please, sir, if I could have a word with you. Inside, sir." The doctor turned back and re-entered the house with the frenzied butler. He said, "What's the matter, man? Pull yourself together." "In here, sir. Come in here." He opened the dining room door. The doctor passed in. Rogers followed him and shut the door behind him. "Well," said Armstrong, "what is it?" The muscles of Rogers' throat were working. He was swallowing. He jerked out, "There's things going on, sir, that I don't understand." Armstrong said sharply, "Things? What things? You think I'm crazy, sir. You say it isn't anything. But it's got to be explained, sir. It's got to be explained, because it doesn't make any sense." "Well, man, tell me what it is. Don't go on talking in riddles." Rogers swallowed again. He said, "It's those little figures, sir, in the middle of the table. The little china figures. 10 of them, there were. I'll swear to that. 10 of them." Armstrong said, "Yes, 10. We counted them last night at dinner." Rogers came nearer. "That's just it, sir. Last night, when I was clearing up, there wasn't but 9, sir. I noticed it and thought it queer, but that's all I thought. And now, sir, this morning, I didn't notice when I laid the breakfast. I was upset and all that. But now, sir, when I came to clear away, see for yourself if you don't believe me. There's only 8, sir. Only 8. It doesn't make sense, does it? Only 8.
Chapter 7.
After breakfast, Emily Brent had suggested to Vera Claythorne that they should walk to the summit again and watch for the boat. Vera had acquiesced. The wind had freshened. Small white crests were appearing on the sea. There were no fishing boats out, and no sign of the motorboat. The actual village of Sticklehaven could not be seen. Only the hill above it. A jutting-out cliff of red rock concealed the actual little bay. Emily Brent said, "The man who brought us out yesterday seemed a dependable sort of person. It is really very odd that he should be so late this morning." Vera did not answer. She was fighting down a rising feeling of panic. She said to herself angrily, "You must keep cool. This isn't like you. You've always had excellent nerves." Aloud, she said after a minute or two, "I wish he would come. I want to get away." Emily Brent said dryly, "I have no doubt we all do." Vera said, "It's all so extraordinary. There seems no meaning in it all." The elderly woman beside her said briskly, "I'm very annoyed with myself for being so easily taken in. Really, that letter is absurd when one comes to examine it. But I had no doubts at the time, none at all." Vera murmured mechanically, "I suppose not." "One takes things for granted too much," said Emily Brent. Vera drew a deep shuddering breath. She said, "Do you really think what you said at breakfast? Be a little more precise, my dear. To what in particular are you referring?" Vera said in a low voice, "Do you really think that Rogers and his wife did away with that old lady?" Emily Brent gazed thoughtfully out to sea. Then she said, "Personally, I'm quite sure of it. What do you think?" "I don't know what to think." Emily Brent said, "Everything goes to support the idea. The way the woman fainted, and the man dropped the coffee tray, remember? Then the way he spoke about it. It didn't ring true." "Oh, yes, I'm afraid they did it." Vera said, "The way she looked scared of her own shadow. I've never seen a woman look so frightened. She must have been always haunted by it." Miss Brent murmured, "I remember a text that hung in my nursery as a child. 'Be sure thy sin will find thee out.' It's very true, that. 'Be sure thy sin will find thee out.'" Vera scrambled to her feet. She said, "But, Miss Brent, in that case—" "Yes, my dear." "The others? What about the others?" "I don't quite understand you." "All the other accusations. They weren't true. But if it's true about the Rogerses—" She stopped, unable to make her chaotic thought clear. Emily Brent's brow, which had been frowning perplexedly, cleared. She said, I understand you now. Well, there is that Mr. Lombard. He admits to having abandoned 20 men to their deaths. Vera said, they were only natives. Emily Brent said sharply, black or white, they are our brothers. Vera thought, our black brothers. Oh, I'm going to laugh. I'm hysterical. I'm not myself. Emily Brent continued thoughtfully. Of course, some of the other accusations were very far-fetched and ridiculous. Against the judge, for instance, who was only doing his duty in his public capacity, and the ex-Scotland Yard man. My own case too. She paused and then went on. Naturally, considering the circumstances, I was not going to say anything last night. It was not a fit subject to discuss before gentlemen. No? Vera listened with interest. Miss Brent continued serenely. Beatrice Taylor was in service with me. Not a nice girl, as I found out too late. I was very much deceived in her. She had nice manners and was very clean and willing. I was very pleased with her, of course. All that was the sheerest hypocrisy. She was a loose girl with no morals. Disgusting. It was some time before I found out that she was what they call in trouble. She paused, her delicate nose wrinkling itself in distaste. It was a great shock to me. Her parents were decent folk too, who had brought her up very strictly. I'm glad to say they did not condone her behavior. Vera said, staring at Miss Brent. What happened? Naturally, I did not keep her now under my roof. No one shall ever say that I condoned immorality. Vera said in a lower voice, what happened to her? Miss Brent said, the abandoned creature, not content with having one sin in her conscience, committed a still graver sin. She took her own life. Vera whispered, horror-struck. She killed herself. Yes, she threw herself into the river. Vera shivered. She stared at the calm, delicate profile of Miss Brent. She said, what did you feel like when you knew she'd done that? Weren't you sorry? Didn't you blame yourself? Emily Brent drew herself up. I had nothing with which to reproach myself. Vera said, but if your hardness drove her to it. Emily Brent said sharply, her own action, her own sin, that was what drove her to it. If she had behaved like a decent, modest young woman, none of this would have happened. She turned her face to Vera. There was no self-reproach, no uneasiness in those eyes. They were hard and self-righteous. Emily Brent sat on the summit of Soldier Island, encased in her own armor of virtue. The little elderly spinster was no longer slightly ridiculous to Vera. Suddenly, she was terrible. Dr. Armstrong came out of the dining room and once more came out on the terrace. The judge was sitting in a chair now, gazing placidly out to sea. Lombard and Blore were over to the left, smoking but not talking. As before, the doctor hesitated for a moment. His eye rested speculatively on Mr. Justice Wargrave. He wanted to consult with someone. He was conscious of the judge's acute logical brain, but nevertheless he wavered. Mr. Justice Wargrave might have a good brain, but he was an elderly man. At this juncture, Armstrong felt what was needed was a man of action. He made up his mind. Lombard, can I speak to you for a minute? Philip started. Of course. The two men left the terrace. They strode down the slope towards the water. When they were out of earshot, Armstrong said, I want a consultation. Lombard's eyebrows went up. He said, my dear fellow, I have no medical knowledge. No. I mean as to the general situation. Oh, that's different. Armstrong said, frankly, what do you think of the position? Lombard reflected a minute. Then he said, it's rather suggestive, isn't it? What are your ideas on the subject of that woman? Do you accept Blore's theory? Philip puffed smoke into the air. He said, it's perfectly feasible, taken alone. Exactly. Armstrong's tone sounded relieved. Philip Lombard was no fool. The letter went on. That is, accepting the premise that Mr. and Mrs. Rogers have successfully got away with murder in their time, and I don't see why they shouldn't. What do you think they did exactly? Poison the old lady? Armstrong said slowly, it might be simpler than that. I asked Rogers this morning what this Miss Brady had suffered from. His answer was enlightening. I don't need to go into medical details, but in a certain form of cardiac trouble, amyl nitrite is used. When an attack comes on, an ampoule of amyl nitrite is broken and it is inhaled. If amyl nitrite were withheld, well, the consequences might easily be fatal. Philip Lombard said thoughtfully, as simple as that. It must have been rather tempting. The doctor nodded. Yes, no positive action, no arsenic to obtain and administer. Nothing definite, just negation. And Rogers hurried through the night to fetch a doctor, and they both felt confident that no one could ever know. Even if anyone knew, nothing could ever be proved against them, added Philip Lombard. He frowned suddenly. Of course, that explains a good deal. Armstrong said, puzzled. I beg your pardon, Lombard said. I mean, in Explain Soldier Island, there are crimes that cannot be brought home to their perpetrators. Instance the Rogerses. Another instance, old Wargrave, who committed his murder strictly within the law. Armstrong said sharply, You believe that story? Philip Lombard smiled. Oh, yes, I believe it. Wargrave murdered Edward Seaton, all right. Murdered him as surely as if he'd stuck a stiletto through him. But he was clever enough to do it from the judge's seat in wig and gown. So, in the ordinary way, you can't bring his little crime home to him. A sudden flash passed like lightning through Armstrong's mind. Murder in hospital. Murder on the operating table. Save. Yes, save as houses. Philip Lombard was saying, hence Mr. Owen, hence Soldier Island. Armstrong drew a deep breath. Now we're getting down to it. What's the real purpose of getting us all here? Philip Lombard said, What do you think? Armstrong said abruptly, Let's go back a minute to this woman's death. What are the possible theories? Rogers killed her because he was afraid she would give the show away. Second possibility, she lost her nerve and took an easy way out herself. Philip Lombard said, Suicide, eh? What do you say to that? Lombard said, It could have been, yes, if it hadn't been for Marston's death. 2 suicides within 12 hours is a little too much to swallow. And if you tell me that Anthony Marston, a young bull with no nerves and precious little brains, got the wind up over having mowed down a couple of kids and deliberately put himself out of the way, well, the idea is laughable. And anyway, how did he get hold of the stuff? From all I've ever heard, potassium cyanide isn't the kind of stuff you take about with you in your waistcoat pocket, but that's your line of country. Armstrong said, Nobody in their senses carries potassium cyanide. It might be done by someone who was going to take a wasp's nest. The ardent gardener or landowner, in fact. Again, not Anthony Marston. It strikes me that cyanide is going to need a bit of explaining. Either Anthony Marston meant to do away with himself before he came here, and therefore came prepared, or else... Armstrong prompted him. Or else... Philip Lombard grinned. Why make me say it? When it's on the tip of your own tongue. Anthony Marston was murdered, of course. Dr. Armstrong drew a deep breath. And Mrs. Rogers? Lombard said slowly, I could believe in Anthony's suicide if it weren't for Mrs. Rogers. I could believe in Mrs. Rogers' suicide if it weren't for Anthony Marston. I can believe that Rogers put his wife out of the way if it were not for the unexpected death of Anthony Marston. But what we need is a theory to explain 2 deaths following rapidly on each other. Armstrong said, I can perhaps give you some help towards that theory. And he repeated the facts that Rogers had given him about the disappearance of the 2 little china figures. Lombard said, Yes, little china figures. There were certainly 10 last night at dinner, and now there are 8, he say. Dr. Armstrong recited, 10 little soldier boys going out to dine. 1 went and choked himself, and then there were 9. 9 little soldier boys sat up very late. 1 overslept himself, and then there were 8. The 2 men looked at each other. Philip Lombard grinned and flung away his cigarette. Fits too damned well to be a coincidence. Anthony Marston dies of asphyxiation or choking last night after dinner, and Mother Rogers oversleeps herself with a vengeance. And therefore, said Armstrong, Lombard took him up. And therefore another kind of soldier, the unknown soldier. X, Mr. Owen, UN Owen, 1 unknown lunatic at large. Ah, Armstrong breathed a sigh of relief. You agree, but you see what it involves. Rogers swore that there was no one but ourselves and he and his wife on the island. Rogers is wrong, or possibly Rogers is lying. Armstrong shook his head. I don't think he's lying. The man's scared. He's scared nearly out of his senses. Philip Lombard nodded. He said, no motorboat this morning. That fits in. Mr. Owen's little arrangements again to the fore. Soldier Island is to be isolated until Mr. Owen has finished his job. Armstrong had gone pale. He said, you realize the man must be a raving maniac. Philip Lombard said, and there was a new ring in his voice. There's one thing Mr. Owen didn't realize. What's that? The island's more or less a bare rock. We shall make short work of searching it. We'll soon ferret out you and Owen, Esquire. Dr. Armstrong said warningly, he'll be dangerous. Philip Lombard laughed. Dangerous? Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? I'll be dangerous when I get hold of him. He paused and said, we'd better rope in Blore to help us. He'll be a good man in a pinch. Better not tell the women. As for the others, the general's gaga, I think, and old Wargrave's fort is masterly inactivity. The three of us can attend to this job.
Chapter 8.
Blore was easily roped in. He expressed immediate agreement with their arguments. What you've said about those china figures, sir, makes all the difference. That's crazy, that is. There's only one thing. You don't think this Owen's idea might be to do the job by proxy, as it were? Explain yourself, man. Well, I mean like this. After the racket last night, this young Marston gets the wind up and poisons himself. And Rogers, he gets the wind up too and bumps off his wife, all according to UNO's plan. Armstrong shook his head. He stressed the point about the cyanide. Blore agreed. Yes, I'd forgotten that. Not a natural thing to be carrying about with you. But how did it get into his drink, sir? Lombard said, I've been thinking about that. Marston had several drinks that night. Between the time he had his last one and the time he finished the one before it, there was quite a gap. During that time his glass was lying about on some table or other. I think, though I can't be sure, it was on the little table near the window. The window was open. Somebody could have slipped a dose of the cyanide into the glass. Blore said unbelievingly, without our all seeing him, sir. Lombard said dryly, we were all rather concerned elsewhere. Armstrong said slowly, that's true. We'd all been attacked. We were walking about, moving about the room, arguing, indignant, intent on our own business. I think it could have been done. Blore shrugged his shoulders. Fact is, it must have been done. Now then, gentlemen, let's make a start. Nobody's got a revolver by any chance. I suppose that's too much to hope for. Lombard said, I've got one. He patted his pocket. Blore's eyes opened very wide. He said in an over-casual tone, always carry that about you, sir. Lombard said, usually. I've been in some tight places, you know. Oh, said Blore and added, well, you've probably never been in a tighter place than you are today. If there's a lunatic hiding on this island, he's probably got a young arsenal on him, to say nothing of a knife or dagger or two. Armstrong coughed. You may be wrong there, Blore. Many homicidal lunatics are very quiet, unassuming people. Delightful fellows. Blore said, I don't feel this one is going to be of that kind, Dr. Armstrong. The three men started on their tour of the island. It proved unexpectedly simple. On the northwest side, towards the coast, the cliffs fell sheer to the sea below, their surface unbroken. On the rest of the island there were no trees and very little cover. The three men worked carefully and methodically, beating up and down from the highest point to the water's edge, narrowly scanning the least irregularity in the rock, which might point to the entrance to a cave. But there were no caves. They came at last, skirting the water's edge, to where General MacArthur sat looking out to sea. It was very peaceful here, with the lap of the waves breaking over the rocks. The old man sat very upright, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He paid no attention to the approach of the searchers. His oblivion of them made one at least faintly uncomfortable. Blore thought to himself, 'Tisn't natural. Looks as though he'd gone into a trance or something. He cleared his throat and said in a would-be conversational tone, "Nice peaceful spot you found for yourself, sir." The general frowned. He cast a quick look over his shoulder. He said, "There is so little time. I really must insist that no one disturbs me." Blore said genially, "We won't disturb you. We're just making a tour of the island, so to speak. Just wondered, if someone might be hiding on it." The general frowned and said, "You don't understand. You don't understand at all. Please go away." Blore retreated. He said as he joined the other two, "He's crazy. It's no good talking to him." Lombard asked with some curiosity, "What did he say?" Blore shrugged his shoulders. "Something about there being no time and that he didn't want to be disturbed." Dr. Armstrong frowned. He murmured, "I wonder now." The search of the island was practically completed. The three men stood on the highest point looking over towards the mainland. There were no boats out. The wind was freshening. Lombard said, "No fishing boats out. There's a storm coming. Damn nuisance you can't see the village from here. We could signal or do something." Blore said, "We might light a bonfire tonight." Lombard said, frowning, "The devil of it is that's all probably been provided for." "In what way, sir?" "How do I know? Practical joke, perhaps. We're to be marooned here. No attention is to be paid to signals, etc. Possibly the village has been told there's a wager on. Some damn fool story anyway." Blore said dubiously, "Think they'd swallow that?" Lombard said dryly, "It's easier of belief than the truth. If the village were told that the island was to be isolated until Mr. Unknown Owen had quietly murdered all his guests, do you think they'd believe that?" Dr. Armstrong said, "There are moments when I can't believe it myself, and yet—" Philip Lombard, his lips curling back from his teeth, said, "And yet, that's just it. You've said it, Doctor." Blore was gazing down into the water. He said, "Nobody could have clambered down here, I suppose." Armstrong shook his head. "I doubt it. It's pretty sheer. Then where could he hide?" Blore said, "There might be a hole in the cliff. If we had a boat now, we could row round the island." Lombard said, "If we had a boat, we'd all be halfway to the mainland by now." "True enough, sir." Lombard said suddenly, "We can make sure of this cliff. There's only one place where there could be a recess, just a little to the right below here. If you fellows can get hold of a rope, you can let me down to make sure." Blore said, "Might as well be sure, though it seems absurd on the face of it. I'll see if I can get hold of something." He started off briskly down to the house. Lombard stared up at the sky. The clouds were beginning to mass themselves together. The wind was increasing. He shot a sideways look at Armstrong. He said, "You're very silent, Doctor. What are you thinking?" Armstrong said slowly, "I was wondering exactly how mad old MacArthur was." Vera had been restless all the morning. She had avoided Emily Brent with a kind of shuddering aversion. Miss Brent herself had taken a chair just round the corner of the house so as to be out of the wind. She sat there knitting. Every time Vera thought of her, she seemed to see a pale drowned face with seaweed entangled in the hair, a face that had once been pretty, impudently pretty perhaps, and which was now beyond the reach of pity or terror. And Emily Brent, placid and righteous, sat knitting. On the main terrace, Mr. Justice Wargrave sat huddled in a porter's chair. His head was poked down well into his neck. When Vera looked at him, she saw a man standing in the dock, a young man with fair hair and blue eyes and a bewildered, frightened face, Edward Seaton, and in imagination she saw the judge's old hands put the black cap on his head and begin to pronounce sentence. After a while, Vera strolled slowly down to the sea. She walked along towards the extreme end of the island, where an old man sat staring out to the horizon. General MacArthur stirred at her approach. His head turned. There was a queer mixture of questioning and apprehension in his look. It startled her. He stared intently at her for a minute or two. She thought to herself, "How queer! It's almost as though he knew." He said, "Ah, it's you. You've come." Vera sat down beside him. She said, "Do you like sitting here looking out to sea?" He nodded his head gently. "Yes," he said. "It's pleasant. It's a good place. I think to wait." "To wait?" said Vera sharply. "What are you waiting for?" he said gently. The end. But I think you know that, don't you? It's true, isn't it? We're all waiting for the end, she said unsteadily. What do you mean? General MacArthur said gravely. None of us are going to leave the island. That's the plan. You know it, of course, perfectly. What perhaps you can't understand is the relief. Vera said wonderingly. The relief? He said, yes, of course. You're very young. You haven't got to that yet. But it does come. The blessed relief when you know that you've done with it all. That you haven't got to carry the burden any longer. You'll feel that too, someday. Vera said hoarsely. I don't understand you. Her fingers worked spasmodically. She felt suddenly afraid of this quiet old soldier. He said musingly, You see, I loved Leslie. I loved her very much. Vera said questioningly, Was Leslie your wife? Yes, my wife. I loved her, and I was very proud of her. She was so pretty and so gay. He was silent for a minute or two. Then he said, Yes, I loved Leslie. That's why I did it. Vera said, You mean, and paused. General MacArthur nodded his head gently. It's not much good denying it now. Not when we are all going to die. I sent Richmond to his death. I suppose, in a way, it was murder. Curious murder. And I've always been such a law-abiding man. But it didn't seem like that at the time. I had no regrets. Serves him damned well right. That's what I thought. But afterwards, in a hard voice, Vera said, Well, afterwards? He shook his head vaguely. He looked puzzled and a little distressed. I don't know. I don't know. It was all different, you see. I don't know if Leslie ever guessed. I don't think so. But, you see, I didn't know about her anymore. She'd gone far away where I couldn't reach her. And then she died, and I was alone. Vera said, Alone, alone. And the echo of her voice came back to her from the rocks. General MacArthur said, You'll be glad too, when the end comes. Vera got up. She said sharply, I don't know what you mean. He said, I know, my child. I know. You don't. You don't understand at all. General MacArthur looked out to sea again. He seemed unconscious of her presence behind him. He said very gently and softly, Leslie? When Blore returned from the house with a rope coiled over his arm, he found Armstrong where he had left him staring down into the depths. Blore said breathlessly, Where's Mr. Lombard? Armstrong said carelessly, Gone to test some theory or other. He'll be back in a minute. Look here, Blore, I'm worried. I should say we're all worried. The doctor waved an impatient hand. Of course. I don't mean it that way. I'm thinking of old MacArthur. What about him, sir? Dr. Armstrong said grimly, What we're looking for is a madman. What prize, MacArthur? Blore said incredulously, You mean he's homicidal? Armstrong said doubtfully, I shouldn't have said so. Not for a minute. But, of course, I'm not a specialist in mental diseases. I haven't really had any conversation with him. I haven't studied him from that point of view. Blore said doubtfully, Gaga, yes, but I wouldn't have said. Armstrong cut in with a slight effort as of a man who pulls himself together. You're probably right. Damn it all. There must be someone hiding on the island. Ah, here comes Lombard. They fastened the rope carefully. Lombard said, I'll help myself all I can. Keep the lookout for a sudden strain on the rope. After a minute or two, while they stood together watching Lombard's progress, Blore said, Climbs like a cat, doesn't he? There was something odd in his voice. Dr. Armstrong said, I should think he must have done some mountaineering in his time. Maybe. There was a silence, and the ex-inspector said, Funny sort of cove altogether. Do you know what I think? What? He's a wrong 'un. Armstrong said doubtfully, In what way? Blore grunted. Then he said, I don't know exactly, but I wouldn't trust him a yard. Dr. Armstrong said, I suppose he'd led an adventurous life. Blore said, I bet some of his adventures have had to be kept pretty dark. He paused and then went on. Did you happen to bring a revolver along with you, Doctor? Armstrong stared. Me? Good Lord, no. Why should I? Blore said, Why did Mr. Lombard? Armstrong said doubtfully, I suppose habit? Blore snorted. A sudden pull came on the rope. For some moments they had their hands full. Presently, when the strain relaxed, Blore said, There are habits and habits. Mr. Lombard takes a revolver to out-of-the-way places, right enough, and a primus, and a sleeping bag, and a supply of bug powder, no doubt. But habit wouldn't make him bring the whole outfit down here. It's only in books people carry revolvers around as a matter of course. Dr. Armstrong shook his head perplexedly. They leaned over and watched Lombard's progress. His search was thorough, and they could see at once that it was futile. Presently he came up over the edge of the cliff. He wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "Well," he said, "we're up against it. It's the house or nowhere." The house was easily searched. They went through the few outbuildings first, and then turned their attention to the building itself. Mrs. Rogers' yard measure discovered in the kitchen dresser assisted them, but there were no hidden spaces left unaccounted for. Everything was plain and straightforward, a modern structure devoid of concealments. They went through the ground floor first. As they mounted to the bedroom floor, they saw through the landing window Rogers carrying out a tray of cocktails to the terrace. Philip Lombard said lightly, "Wonderful animal, the good servant. Carries on with an impassive countenance." Armstrong said appreciatively, "Rogers is a first-class butler. I'll say that for him." Blore said his wife was a pretty good cook too. That dinner last night. They turned into the first bedroom. 5 minutes later they faced each other on the landing. No one hiding, no possible hiding place. Blore said, "There's a little stair here." Dr. Armstrong said, "It leads up to the servants' room." Blore said, "There must be a place under the roof, for cisterns, water tank, etc. It's the best chance, and the only one." And it was then, as they stood there, that they heard the sound from above, a soft furtive footfall overhead. They all heard it. Armstrong grasped Blore's arm. Lombard held up an admonitory finger. "Quiet, listen." It came again, someone moving softly, furtively, overhead. Armstrong whispered, "He's actually in the bedroom itself, the room where Mrs. Rogers' body is." Blore whispered back, "Of course, best hiding place he could have chosen. Nobody likely to go there. Now then, quiet as you can." They crept stealthily upstairs. On the little landing outside the door of the bedroom they paused again. Yes, someone was in the room. There was a faint creak from within. Blore whispered, "Now." He flung open the door and rushed in. The other two closed behind him. Then all three stopped dead. Rogers was in the room, his hands full of garments. Blore recovered himself first. He said, "Sorry, Rogers. Heard someone moving about in here, and thought, well..." He stopped. Rogers said, "I'm sorry, gentlemen. I was just moving my things. I take it there will be no objection if I take one of the vacant guest chambers on the floor below, the smallest room." It was to Armstrong that he spoke, and Armstrong replied, Of course. Get on with it." He avoided looking at the sheeted figure lying on the bed. Rogers said, "Thank you, sir." He went out of the room with his arm full of belongings and went down the stairs to the floor below. Armstrong moved over to the bed and, lifting the sheet, looked down on the peaceful face of the dead woman. There was no fear there now, just emptiness. Armstrong said, "Wish I'd got my stuff here. I'd like to know what drug it was." Then he turned to the other two. "Let's get finished. I feel it in my bones we're not going to find anything." Blore was wrestling with the bolts of a low manhole. He said, "That chap moves damn quietly. A minute or two ago we saw him in the garden. None of us heard him come upstairs." Lombard said, "I suppose that's why we assumed it must be a stranger moving about up here." Blore disappeared into a cavernous darkness. Lombard pulled a torch from his pocket and followed. 5 minutes later, 3 men stood on an upper landing and looked at each other. They were dirty and festooned with cobwebs, and their faces were grim. There was no one on the island but their 8 selves.
Unwieldy. Unwieldy. Adjective. Of an object. Difficult to move because of its size, shape, or weight. Probationer. Probationer. Noun. A person who is serving a probationary or trial period in a job or position to which they are newly appointed. Amyl nitrite. Amyl nitrite. Noun. A yellowish volatile synthetic liquid used medicinally as a vasodilator. It is rapidly absorbed by the body on inhalation, used for its stimulatory effects. Proxy. Proxy. Noun. The authority to represent someone else, especially in voting. Maroon. Maroon. Verb. Leave someone trapped and alone in an inaccessible place, especially an island. Admonitory. Admonitory. Adjective. Giving or conveying a warning or reprimand.